sporting event or something. Anyways, I'm really excited now to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Jean Nelson. Jean graduated from Harvey Mudd College with a Bachelor of Science degree in biophysics, then went on to earn a PhD in radiation biophysics from SUNY Buffalo. A long and varied professional career began shortly thereafter. And boy, it sure is varied. Jean has been employed by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Technicon, Corning Diagnostics, Koyamunga Community College, Microsoft as a contractor, Collin Community College, Genuity, the U.S. Census Bureau, the Cal Poly University, and Cuesta College. He's worked as a freelance investigative journalist and computer consultant, and is currently employed as an independent IT contractor. Jean has been active in matters of science and public policy, providing expert testimony before the Diablo Canyon Independent Safety Committee, the California Coastal Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the State Water Resources Control Board, and the California Public Utilities Commission. I've seen him numerous times speak at the Morro Bay City Council, at the Board of Supervisors. Here, he is a wealth of information, so let's welcome Jean Nelson.
It's not,
Takes a second. There we go.
change the input. Okay, so change source. Right. Good evening. Again, my name is Jean Nelson, and my main thing that I've been involved with isn't IT. It's working to educate our policymakers and doing that through a nonprofit that I helped to found back in 2013 called Californians for Green Nuclear Power. Tonight, I'm going to be talking in a general way about our power grid, something that we kind of take for granted. You flip the light switch and the lights come on. Well, there's a lot of technology behind that. Colloquially, it's called the grid, and it's probably the most complicated system ever created by human beings. But my motto for that power grid, which has been in existence for more than a century, is keep it simple. So, here we go. Oh, I should have heard it in a few places.
There's another word that comes after that.
I know that, but I'm trying to be polite. I'm trying to focus on a concept here. So it turns out that while we think about lights and things like that as being the big thing that the grid powers, what it really powers are three-phase motors. So one of the other jobs that I had was I worked in a winery up in Paso Robles called Bianchi Winery, and there I was a cellar hand helping to make wine, and we use a lot of electricity to do that, big pumps to move things in and out of tanks and filter them and so forth. So that's an example of, that's a small, these motors are probably 100 horsepower. Those are small motors. So we're going to talk about some big motors, and they're really important. They're life-saving or life-sustaining function. So we have something called the California Water Project. The California Water Project uses around 20% of our power, and the big thing that has to happen is that water gets pumped across from north of Sacramento down through the Central Valley in these big canals, and then it has to go over the Tehachapi Mountains to get to Los Angeles. So this is an idea, this helps to give you an idea of how big this machinery is. Those are human beings there, and there's 14 of these. 14 of these giant pumps that their job is to literally push the water uphill almost 2,000 feet. Now, if you ever lugged water before, you can have a keen appreciation that it takes a lot of energy to move water, but that water is absolutely critical to Southern California. If this stops, you have a whole bunch of people going thirsty, you have a bunch of fires that you can't put out, you have a bunch of businesses that can't do their business because they don't have that lifeblood called water. And in fact, in California, one motto that I'm aware of is political power flows from the control of water. And that's, of course, we have a lot of state bureaucracy. So again, this plant is called the Edmonston Pumping Plant. There are 14, 80,000 horsepower motors, 12 stories tall. That's about 120 feet. And so if you want to, this is part of a photo essay from a journalist that is really interested in water. But I created what's called a tiny URL. Everybody else heard of tiny URLs before? So this one is I've made a custom one. It's THE-BIG-lift, L-I-F-T. And that's what this is colloquially called, the big lift to move that water. Well, it turns out that this is again another view. They went to a better design to pump the water. This is again at least the steps here give you an idea, and there's 14 of these. So it's a big job to move all that water uphill. To do that, they need a power station. This is a view of the Pastoria Generation Station. It used to be coal, but of course California said, oh, we can't have coal within the state of California, so now it's run by natural gas. But it's a big plant. It's a little bit less than 1/3 the size of Diablo Canyon Power Plant, but its job is to power that water up the hill. So you need a lot of energy to do that. So there's a general term for generators that are under human control. They're called dispatchable generators, i.e. you can issue a dispatch order to turn on or off the power. And with a power grid, you always, from every instant, you have to keep the demand and the supply in perfect balance. And that is, of course, where your dispatch orders come in. So we have several different kinds of dispatchable generators, starting with large hydroelectric dams. Everybody thinks of Hoover Dam. That's 2,078 megawatts, and it runs typically about 1/4 of the year because the river doesn't run. There's not enough water in the Colorado River Basin. So we've got large hydroelectric dams. We've got coal-fired power plants like the Pastoria plant used to be. I don't know if anybody else has heard of something called Four Corners, a very infamous coal-fired power plant right at the border where those four states come together. Coal, of course, is famous because it's also really toxic. It produces both toxic air pollution, things like sulfur oxides and nitrogen, and as an added bonus, mercury, the thing that made Lewis Carroll famous with the Mad Hatter. And then you got water pollution because you produce these huge amounts of ash, rain falls on these piles, and you then get water pollution, and one of the big problems is arsenic, which I hope everybody recognizes as toxic. Okay? Gas-fired power plants. Now, 50 years ago, gas power was a luxury. And as a result, it was only used to meet what's called the late afternoon and early evening load peaks, which were small. but they would have gas generators that come because gas was so expensive. And there has been obviously some technology changes that have made gas much less expensive, but it's still a very real issue. And the other problem with gas is it's just in time. Because it is a gas, it's very bulky, and there's no practical way to store it at the power plant. Unlike, for example, coal, where you have a great big coal heap that you can get to. But the advantage of gas is that it produces relatively small amounts of emissions, pollutants, for every unit of power that's generated. So that's why it's called clean. Of course, I also like it because I like to cook with gas as opposed to using a electric stove. So because you can instantly control it. Our home is heated with gas. Little fun fact, the company that became Southern California Gas was the inventor of the gas heater. And figuring out how to do it safely, because there are toxic products of combustion, but figuring how to safely heat your home and doing it was actually some clever engineering involved. Then we have oil-fired power plants. Now, some of you are old enough to probably recall back when the plant here in Morro Bay burned oil. It was so bad, the air pollution here was so bad, this area in the early 70s was what was called a non-attainment area by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, because there was so much pollution from those, from burning all that oil. And it wasn't like the nice oil you put in your car engines. No, this was called bottoms. This is the real heavy stuff. You heat it up a whole bunch, and then you burn it kind of like coal, but it does make a lot more pollution. And PG&E, then owner of that plant, then said, all right, we've got to clean that act up. And so they said they put in a new gas line and converted it to gas. Then there were a bunch of new regulations imposed by the state of California, and of course the plant is currently unoccupied, but it's something we've got to watch very, very closely, because there's a plan to convert it, just like the Moss Landing power plant, to a battery storage system, because it's next to the grid. Then finally we have nuclear generation. Diablo Canyon Power Plant is California's largest generator. It's safe, affordable, reliable, and what's also significant, you don't really get this until you're in the plant, it's big. So this is, these people are looking into the generator. The generator stands about 20 feet tall, and when these are steam turbines, so what's happening is that the nuclear reactor is generating steam. The steam comes in on these pipes over here, down there, and there are some high pressure pipes, and that turns turbines. And when you turn the turbines, then you can, in this generator, you can generate power. And this thing generates a lot of power. If we look at dispatchable power, i.e. under human control, this plant generates about 10% of California's power. And it does it in a footprint of about 1 square mile. The plant is also built very, very ruggedly. So, for example, when the San Simeon earthquake occurred in December of 2003, that was a magnitude 6.3 earthquake. It was powerful enough to kill 2 in Paso Robles from unreinforced brick structures that collapsed, and caused between $250 and $350 million in damage, mostly to San Luis Obispo County. Diablo Canyon was running at full power before, during, and after. They did inspect the plant carefully, but it was completely unaffected by that big earthquake. Does anybody here remember the San Simeon earthquake? All right, we have a few folks that I was still back east at the time of this earthquake, so I missed it. But I was in Southern California for example, for the Silmar quake in '71.
My chimney broke.
Yeah, that's a very common problem with earthquakes. So what you have to have is a structure that's really strong. So this plant uses a lot of steel, big I-beams. And I led a tour of Cuesta College students when I was a physics prof there. And so we went down into the basement of this part of the building. This is a power deck. And I'm dwarfed by the size of the beams that are used to construct this turbine building. And they, right next to where we were standing, they had one of the anchors. Now, what they did was they drilled down, put in a reinforced concrete column that's about 4 or 5 feet wide. And so you can see that anchor where the steel is being tied to that, and that goes down 100 feet into the rock. So again, everything has been designed as the proverbial brick shithouse. So now then, we'll look at this is a new problem. This is a new problem. As an engineer, I call this parasitic power. The parasitic power is solar, wind, and batteries. The grid was doing fine without these added to it. So again, we had roughly almost a century before they started putting meaningful amounts of solar, wind, and then eventually batteries onto the system. I used to be a solar energy advocate because that was one of the things I was doing for my research when I worked at NASA JPL. It makes perfect sense when you have a mission that's orbiting around the Earth that you need something to get continuous power. And so, that technology was developed to serve those missions in space. And so US developed that, and then somebody said, let's start putting that on the grid. And the problem is that when you look at solar and wind, they don't have the muscle that those big rotating machines have. They're what are called inverter-based resources. An inverter is a device that takes direct current and turns it into alternating current. And that is limited by the strength of those electronics, and they're not really strong, so you don't get the kind of muscle that you need. So that's one of the reasons why this is called parasitic power. The other is that it's there not when we want it, we human beings want it, when we need it to power hospitals or things like that, run factories, or pump water uphill. It's there with the vagaries of the weather for wind, which is mostly tied to solar cycles, and to whether the sun is overhead or not. The percent of full power on time for solar is only about 20%, and that's limited by the laws of physics. The sun doesn't stay overhead, and so as a result, you get less, you don't get very much power out of the sun. And it's needed, it's supplied at a time when we don't need the power. So we have to actually do something called curtailing it. Curtailing is very expensive. It costs at least $2 billion a year to curtail excess solar power. And then we have this latest thing, the batteries. They're saying, well, gee, this is maybe a solution to the problem. The problem with batteries is they're horribly expensive. We have a booth at the downtown farmers market, and we have it powered by a little lithium battery and an inverter that then runs the lights in our booth. And that little package costs us around $350. So if you have inverters and batteries necessary to run the state of California, it would cost twice what the state budget is, twice the state budget. And those batteries only last between 10 and 15 years, and then you got to replace them. So there'll be this perpetual cycle of replacing batteries. Now, how many here have electric vehicles? Show of hands. Got a few. They're inexpensive to operate, but very expensive to purchase. And so that's for me, if I'm concerned about the environment, that's where I would want to put my money if I had a bunch of money. I don't, because I actually give it away to this project. But batteries, I think is better reserved for cars rather than for the purported environmental benefits. Now, it turns out there was an article that was published on August the 8th, 2016, in the Washington Post. Turns out wind and solar have a secret friend, natural gas. And I've made another tiny URL for that, natural-gas-secret. And it is really a secret that what you do, because you have that intermittent power, you have to then fill in those blanks. That's called firming the power. And most of that's done by having a huge fleet of gas-fired generators that are dedicated to filling in the blanks. The rule is that you need about 105% of the nameplate capacity, which is the best case generation from those solar and wind generators. In California right now, we have almost 30,000 megawatts of solar and wind, and that includes, of course, rooftop solar. That means there has to be a huge natural gas fleet that has to be able to respond very quickly, because, of course, a cloud comes over a solar farm, something like that. You've got to quickly keep everything in balance. So natural gas is the only way to do that. So, almost done. Oops, we went the wrong way. Okay, let's go forward. Oops. What the heck is happening here? Okay, so next we have something called the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Most people have probably never heard of it, but our fight against offshore wind is very important that we understand what the Renewable Portfolio Standard is, because it's a set of governmentally favored generators that are given a variety of preferences because I think it's because their lobbyists are darn good. And of course, offshore wind is one of those things that's been put into the RPS. My holding is that the RPS was actually designed to exclude some really good generators. So non-RPS generators include large hydroelectric and nuclear power, both of which are emission-free. But the thing is, if you have natural gas that you want to sell, you want to do everything possible to disadvantage the competitors to natural gas. And that is exactly what the Renewable Portfolio Standard does. So that's a relatively new creation. It was started around 2000. Companies like Enron played a really important role in pushing through Renewable Portfolio Standards. And the thing, also they try to emphasize, look at the fact that solar, the energy source is free, wind, the energy source is free, but when you look at all the complexity, all the technology that's required to keep those things running, they're anything but free. And in fact, offshore wind is the most expensive form of grid-scale generation. And then we have the subsidy seekers. I've shown this before. I had it when our previous speaker, I had a poster here, but I want to read it again. For example, on wind energy, we get a tax credit if we build a lot of wind farms. That's the only reason to build them. They don't make sense without the tax credit. That is Warren Buffett, CEO of Berkshire Hathaway Energy. He said that in a quote in 2014 to U.S. News and World Report. I was supposed to put on I actually have the WindScan, it's the tiny URL for that. So he has recognized how important these subsidies are. He's sitting right now on about $6 billion in tax credits. So He also sells a lot of coal-fired power into California, and he can shelter the profits that he makes selling that coal-fired power into California with all these wind production tax credits and other little incentives that he gets. Okay, just to close up, this is, I think, a really telling photograph. We just had the Moss Landing battery fire, probably the biggest battery fire in history. And so I have created a tiny URL if you want to watch this video. It's only 9 minutes long, but it's really incredibly informative. So it's tinyurl.com moss-landing-01-19. And 01-19 is because the video was created on YouTube on January 19th. So that was 3 days after this thing caught on fire. And so what we're looking at here is we're overhead over what's called the turbine hall that used to be there at Moss Landing. Essentially a total loss of the building. You can see it's still burning on the 19th. And this fire was, I'm hoping that most people have seen images of the fire by now on YouTube or so forth. You'll see some great ones at the beginning of this as well. This video was created by a person who wears two different hats. He is a firefighter, but he's also a mechanical engineer, so he understands the technology. And he is sharply critical. The big problem of this particular installation was there's no isolation between the batteries. So once one battery caught on fire, basically the whole thing caught on fire. And of course produced lots of toxic smoke. And that toxic smoke has now fallen into the nation's salad bowl. What could go wrong? What could go wrong in South County with Caballero wind storage right next to the strawberry fields there on the Nipomo Basin? Anyway,
Do you
this
know the value of the loss of the building?
the value. Well, that's hard. I'm actually in the process of trying to get that information. I have been able to calculate how many storage modules were in the thing, so I'm going to try to get some catalog prices. But I'm sure that the loss is denominated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Just totally up in smoke. And the problem with these batteries is they're reliable when you first put them in, but gradually over time, as you go through all the charge and discharge cycles, they develop internal shorts, and eventually one of those batteries, all it has to be is one little battery, essentially like the size that you put in your, I have some flashlights that use these kinds of batteries, the lithium batteries. One of them goes off, and then the heat that generates sets off the ones around it, and you quickly get into this self-destructive cascade. But again, this is a bonus for what happens on power grids. This is what we shouldn't be doing in California. Instead, we should be generating our power just when we need it, using reliable technology, and for the dispatchable technology, the biggest benefit is from environmental benefits from nuclear. We have some limitations on large hydro because there's only so much rain. California's had a lot of problems recently with drought. We're coming into another drought right now. So that's the problem with large hydro. The cleanest of the remaining dispatchable sources is, again, natural gas, and then oil, and then coal. So, any questions about what I've raised? Yes?
Maybe you know the answer to this. I've heard that the primary reason that they want large amounts of energy at all added to the grid is because of the enormous amount of energy that is dedicated to data storage.
Nope.
No?
Nope. Go back to that, think about that first slide I showed you, that giant pump that one of
It's the water
14.
plant.
That used, that, in California, about 1/5 of our power is used to pump, and that includes pumping out of the ground. How many people have wells? Anybody? We got a couple people here, great. So that takes a lot of energy to pump that water out of the ground. And so pumping water, moving it from Northern California to Southern California, that takes a lot of energy. Here, in the Central Coast, there is an actual special canal. It's a diversion, it's a subsidiary of the main California Water Project. And I've studied that a lot because I'm a technology or infrastructure nerd. But when you come up Highway 40, let's see, it'll be 46, it actually roughly parallels where that is then, comes to a giant pumping station, gets pumped up over the grade, over the crest there, and then flows down by gravity in and basically supplies the Central Coast. I came here in 2006, and it was around that time they were putting in this giant, it's basically about 5 foot across pipe that goes from that peak all the way down to Lake Nacimiento. So that's California Water Project water. And of course, what I noticed, because we, in San Luis Obispo, we're supplied by that water, the water quality, the water taste went way up when we finally started to get that water. But it just took a long time for us to get it. And that water is supplied all the way down past Santa Barbara. So it's a very important project. It crosses the San Andreas Fault right near Killeen, California. And they wisely put this giant aqueduct pipe. It's above ground where it crosses the San Andreas Fault, just like some natural gas pipelines. So, next question.
So I've heard for years that we haven't done what we needed to do to protect the grid. What would that look like?
Well, it really depends on your point of view.
Okay.
For me, what it would look like is a lot more nuclear power plants because they're environmentally friendly and you could pretty much put them anywhere. The best example of that was until recently, our largest nuclear power plant in the United States served Phoenix, Arizona, right in the middle of the desert. So they came up with a clever way to actually take the treated water, the reclaimed water from the Phoenix metro area, and they used that to do the cooling that's necessary to generate electricity. So, and there's new technology out there called small modular reactors. They can be put, the goal is to eventually make them produced in a factory and put them everywhere they're needed. And again, they can run 24/7. Yeah?
What about the issue with once-through cooling at the other plant?
A literal red herring. Total red herring. All right, so when that plant was put in, the requirement was that the difference between the inlet water, the temperature of the inlet water, and the outfall had to be limited to less than 10 degrees Celsius or about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Oftentimes it's less than that. The water comes in at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, goes through the plant, and they use such huge amounts of it that, again, we get this very small temperature rise. So the opponents try to say that outfall lagoon where the water comes back into the ocean, that it's just a desert. No, it's actually a thriving marine ecosystem. It's just that the fish and stuff that have gotten in there, and they're just by chance, it's not like we put them in there, they're better adapted to temperatures about 100 miles south. So, for example, Garibaldi, which is a California state fish, there's a colony of them in the outfall of Diablo Canyon. Now, water, when it's slightly warmer, even the 18 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit warmer, it's less dense than the water underneath. So you can, apparently scuba divers can actually see this interface between the warm water, which is floating on the surface, and the cooler water that's found there. And so as a result, what happens is that just kind of goes out into the Pacific and quickly is absorbed by the world's largest heat sink, which is the Pacific Ocean. The amount of energy that's being added by the plant is comparable to what happens if the sun's directly overhead and shines on about 2 to 3 square miles of ocean. So it's really not a big issue. But opponents of nuclear have seized upon it as a way to try to shut these plants down. This has also been utilized, again, those natural gas plants, like there's one in Oxnard and several south of Oxnard. They're occasionally used natural gas-fired power plants that use once-through cooling. And of course, Governor Newsom figured out, hey, we need to keep the lights on, because he wants to eventually be president, remember? That in order to do that, they've granted essentially perpetual waivers to those plants. And they make noise about, oh yeah, we're gonna turn them off. But the problem is that when we have the hot spells at the end of August and into the first part of September, that's when our grid is most heavily strained. And if you didn't have power, people's air conditioners, for example, wouldn't be working. And if you live in a place like Bakersfield, air conditioning is not a luxury. It's a necessity because it gets so stiflingly hot there. We're kind of spoiled here on the coast, but again, there are really important reasons why we need to keep the power running, and the power has to be able to run when there's these huge power demands. And that's why you need power like nuclear and natural gas. Yes?
I was just wondering, can you explain more about curtailing?
Curtailing, okay. So again, we can't, we always have to keep the power demand, supply and demand balanced. And in the middle of the day, you've got all these solar panels absorbing energy from the sun and converting it into electricity and putting it on the grid. Now, if you just took all that power and put it on the grid, the voltage would get too high and you'd be burning out equipment. Not a very good outcome. So I happen to, because I'm, again, a nerd that pays attention to this kind of thing, one day when I was driving back from Fresno, I was on 41, driving back from Fresno, and I was east of Interstate 5, and I saw this giant solar collection farm, whatever you want to call it, and all the panels were facing the wrong way. That's curtailment. And there was a nearby solar collection thing where and this was in the late afternoon, that's when you need the most power. And those panels were oriented correctly. The thing about large-scale solar is it's dispatched by the independent system operator, California ISO. And so the ISO sent an order to that big farm, says, turn your panels all the wrong way. They do the same thing for wind. They can feather the blades. And so again, I have to go up to the PUC a lot. I go to the state legislature. So I'm up and down either through Salinas Valley or through the Central Valley. And most of the time, when I pass these great big wind collectors, they're just sitting there.
I've heard too that they have to like give it to other states.
No, they have to pay. That's another thing. They pay for other states to take it. And we end up paying for them to take it. So it's another cost. Curtailment is a cost, and from an economic standpoint, it's a total economic, because we get nothing. All we do is we just pay. And again, we have to keep that supply and demand always in balance, and that's why we need to curtail. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it just seems strange that we're curtailing already power.
Yeah.
Why are we adding more?
Well, think back to that Warren Buffett quote, because he drives so much of California energy policy, and I've seen it up close and personal when I'm attending hearings, and they're talking about, he has his nice polished lobbyists there, and they're talking about, oh, we need such and such, and it's always to provide economic benefit to him. And of course, the wind production tax credit was supposed to have expired back in 2004. And of course, the lobbyists have always kept it going. Same thing for solar. So we have far too much solar and wind in California right now. But the subsidy seekers want to get their subsidies, so we're going to continue to see more growth in that. And when you go to the CAISO website, they're just so ecstatic that there's all this solar and wind power. And of course, you have to dig further to find out, oh yeah, here's this great big loss. Yes?
Now, I know Natalia up here mentioned it, that from what I read, there's just been an explosion of permit requests for new data centers, which we know take a tremendous amount of energy. They've got just rooms like that full of computers.
Right.
So as far as, why we're, the plan to build all this new wind and solar, it seems like part of that plan is to be able to power those systems. Is that not correct?
So we get into, I've actually been in that biz. Remember, that was one of the things in my background.
Yeah.
And it turns out that one of the big things that you have to have the power for is to run the air conditioning systems. Those air conditioning systems have giant monster motors, just like the ones you have in your home, but just so much bigger. And so you need this power again with the muscle. You don't get it from solar or wind, and that's part of this whole concept of why solar and wind are so bad for the grid. That's why I use the term parasitic power, because they really don't. Yes.
And that's why a lot of the big corporations that have these computer centers are buying smaller nuclear facilities close by.
They're trying to do that.
They're
So,
trying to do that, right?
so for example, Microsoft just set up a contract with Constellation Energy, which is the biggest operator of nuclear power plants in the United States, to restart up 3 Mile Island Unit 1, which is the one that worked just fine after the meltdown of Unit 2. But with cheap natural gas in about 2019, they turned it off, but they're going to apparently bring it back. Just a little, I like to be honest in my disclosure. My wife and I own a tiny little block of Constellation Energy. It's done really well. Its ticker symbol is CEG, if you're interested. Yes?
So, when you talk about the muscle,
Yeah.
are you saying that solar and wind are not good at producing three-phase? You have three-phase up there.
No, it's not a three-phase thing. What it actually has to do with, there's two interrelated concepts that I didn't really want to get into, but I'll at least name them for you. One is called synchronous grid inertia, which is the property of a large rotating machine to keep generating power and can instantaneously convert between the kinetic energy and the electrical energy. So that's something that big generators are really good at, that again, solar or wind can't do at all. And then the other thing is something called power factor, which we get into vector analysis and other exciting things like that. It's for those that are that might remember this from their physics classes, Eli the Iceman, which is that the voltage leads the current when you're dealing with inductive loads, and it lags when you're dealing with capacitive loads. And inductive loads are those large motors. Yes?
There's another kind of energy, I'm sure you know about, but when I see it on any kind of media, they always label it corn ethanol. And I'm not talking about that. There's a man His name is Dave Hogue. He has an organic farm in the Watsonville area.
Okay,
And he runs everything on ethanol that he distills from waste plants.
more than likely, he's also got a PG&E account. Because he needs power to run the stills that take essentially, it takes a lot of energy to get the ethanol out of the water. That you know, after you've brewed the ethanol from the corn, I mean, it's so energetically wasteful. You actually have to put more energy in, even with the free energy from the sun that made the corn in the first place. You have to put more energy in by either natural gas or electricity or both to get out your finished product.
Well,
And-
remember, he's not using corn.
okay, well, whatever he's using some biological substance that has starch in it, because that's how that's how any fermentation process works. And the problem is, it was something that was cooked up, I think, by some lobbyists, and it is so incredibly wasteful of energy. It's, you know, they say, oh yeah, this is energy independence. No, there's no way. So I think I'm just about to get the hook here.
We have another couple questions. This has been so interesting, but we've got an 8 o'clock close time.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, fighting Diablo Canyon and all that to shut it down, there's a lot of derogatories that, made it bad.
Yeah.
And I wonder where the word has gone now.
Well, if we think about propaganda, go back to Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels said that the way that you make people believe a lie is you repeat it enough. And the reality is that nuclear power is the safest and cleanest form of grid-scale power generation. It's cost-effective, particularly when it's not burdened with all kinds of nonsense, which has been one of the games that's played. So, yeah, there's been a bunch of nasty things said about Diablo Canyon, but the thing that I find as a radiation biophysicist, so I understand the interaction between ionizing radiation and living systems, is that most of it is lies or exaggerations. So that sort of answers your question?
Yeah, I just wonder if it's improved in its technology.
No, it was always safe. It was always safe. So, and when CGNP set up its booth downtown at the farmer's market in 2017, the antis tried to chase us away. They said, oh, you're not supposed to be here at the farmer's market. Thankfully, the farmer's market recognizes how important the First Amendment is.
Throughout the whole chain of fuel gatherings and processing to disposal of nuclear.
Even when you look at all those things, so we can look at the life cycle carbon emissions, it's really very, very benign, and there's lots of it, so we're not going to run out of it. And again, lots of exaggeration about how dangerous the so-called spent nuclear fuel is. So that's just
That's the nature of movements.
yeah. You have to scare people, and good lies are really effective at that.
All right, well, thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks for explaining so we can